Hello, everybody, and welcome again to Fossil Friday Chats. As always, I'm one of your hosts, Brittany Stoneberg, the Outreach Communications Coordinator for the Western Science Center, and this Mastodon is going to be very relevant today. Joining me, as always, is our other host.
Hi, everybody. Happy Lunar New Year. I'm Gabriel Santos from the Alf Museum.
Oh, and joining us today to talk about something that I am very predictably, quite excited about, is Dr. Katy Smith, Curator of Paleontology and Associate Professor of Geology at Georgia Southern University. Katy, I miss you. It's so great to see you.
I miss you too.
So, if viewers aren't familiar, Katy and I know each other because several years ago she came to the Western Science Center as part of a week-long conference called Valley of the Mastodons, which was a conference that resulted in many things, including the naming of the Pacific mastodon as a new species in 2019. So I miss you, Katy. It is so glad to have you here. I am so happy we're going to be talking about some mastodons today. That's my happy place. Alrighty. Let's see. So, if you're not super familiar with Katy, let's go ahead and introduce you to her. She has wanted to be a paleontologist for as long as she can remember. Although she's a lover of all things extinct, her passion is, of course, the study of mastodons. She currently studies these and other mammals as a teacher scholar at Georgia Southern University. Yeah, I'm all about mastodons. I'm pretty predictable, so I'm very excited for this talk. Let's see. Alrighty. So, hey everybody. So if you have questions for Dr. Katy Smith, as always, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll have a Q&A session after her presentation. So if you have any particular questions about anything regarding the presentation, put them in the chat. We will do our best to get to as many as we can. So, alrighty. Katy, whenever you are ready, take it away and tell us about some mastodons.
All right.
My excitement.
Very happy to tell you all about mastodons. So thanks for having me. This is really exciting. I always love talking about mastodons. They are my favorite extinct animal, and they are my favorite extinct animal to study. So when I was thinking about how do I frame this research for you today, I realized that this really can come down to two mastodons from two different regions. I've got on the left, Max from the west coast of North America, and then on the right, we have Chaz from the east coast of North America. So perhaps because of their geographic differences, these two mastodons also exhibit physical differences. So what I want to talk to you about today is basically the different ways that we can characterize mastodons. What are the differences between these two mastodons of their respective regions? What are the similarities between them? And ultimately, what might these differences and similarities mean? That would be our overarching question, and the question that you as a paleontologist want to think about today. Okay. So we have to start out with the basics. Any of you Western Science Center member viewers are well aware of all of this, but it's always important that we recognize what is and what isn't a mastodon. So there's a couple of characteristics that mastodons have that distinguish them from some of their other relatives. And I have the arrows pointing here to show that first they have a long, flat back. They have a relatively flat head and a relatively long jaw. And they have tusks that are robust, so they've got a really thick circumference, but they tend not to cross in the front. A big difference, that's probably the easiest difference to see, is in their teeth. So mastodon teeth are rows of conical cusps, and this itself is one individual tooth, and it's quite a large tooth if you have to hold it with both hands. So this is a mastodon. Mastodons are not mammoths. So in comparison, we can look at some of these characteristics for mammoths. You see it's got a big domed head, a short jaw. It's got these long curvy tusks that sometimes cross in the front, and it has a short sloping back. Their teeth look very different, as I mentioned. So instead of those rows of cones, we have this flat shearing surface. So mastodons and their big conical cusps are well adapted for eating things like branches and leaves, whereas mammoths have teeth that are really well adapted for shearing grasses. And I just want to take one moment to acknowledge my scale. This is Christina Olson, and Christina Olson attended that Valley of the Mastodons. I guess she was kind of our poet laureate of the conference, and she ended up writing a book of poetry about Max and the Western Science Center called The Last Mastodon that you should definitely check out if you would like to hear more about science from the poetic side. All right, another thing that I want to mention is that mastodons are not dinosaurs. I know this is a common misconception that everything that's big and extinct is a dinosaur. So this is an image of just a collection of toys that were labeled as dinosaurs. But if we get down to it, many of these are not dinosaurs. We have things like marine reptiles and flying reptiles and mammals that certainly don't fall into the category of dinosaurs. So not everything that's big and extinct is a dinosaur, but that doesn't mean that it's any less cool. All right. Mastodons are not actually elephants, even though they superficially resemble them. They are distantly related. So this is an evolutionary tree of the order Proboscidea. And Proboscidea includes all of mastodons, elephants, mammoths, and all their common ancestors going all the way back down here. The earliest proboscidean was about 55 million years ago with this guy here called Phosphotherium. And Phosphotherium, there's an artist depiction of this animal over here, and it had a little bitty, likely had a little bitty trunk. So if we look at this diagram, we see mastodons over here, we see mammoths and elephants over here. So again, they're not elephants. We can think of them more as distant cousins of elephants. One thing that all proboscideans share are tusks, and tusks are enlarged, ever-growing incisors. So your two front teeth and the teeth next to those are incisors. Tusks come in a variety of shapes and sizes based on their species, whether they're male or female, how well preserved they are, and what age they are. For example, this is a modern, on the bottom, a modern African elephant tusk from a male. This is a male mastodon tusk, and this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one are all female mastodons. This one here is a juvenile mammoth. So they might all look the same, but there's actually ways that you can characterize the differences between them. You'll note right away that some of them are a lot straighter and some of them are a lot curvier than others. So even within the same species, there's variation in size and shape. All right, so these are the mastodon's ever-growing teeth, and these are our ever-growing teeth. So once again, if you had a tusk, that means that the tooth next to your big front tooth, your second incisor, would grow continuously throughout life and would stick outside of your mouth. So it would keep growing and growing and growing. These tusks grow until the individual dies. They grow in layers. So this is actually a tree trunk cut into cross section, because many of you are probably familiar with the annual layers that you can see as trees grow. So you've got these light areas of growth and these dark areas and these light and dark areas, and the light and dark together are 1 year of growth. So if you cut a tusk down the same way, you would see a very similar pattern, because tusks also grow in layers. So like trees, you can count the rings in a tusk and tell how old that mastodon is. The difference between trees and tusks have to do with the shape of their layers. So tusk layers themselves are cone-shaped, whereas the tree layers are more cylinder-shaped. So basically, I like to think of a tusk as sugar cones stacked one inside of the other, in which each sugar cone is 1 year of growth. And as the tusk grows, new material grows inside that tusk of the previous year, and then that tusk erupts forward. So basically what we have here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. That would represent 6 years in a mastodon's life. Okay, so because of the way that they grow, tusks are actually timelines. So we can look at the tusk and we can look at changes in the life of that individual based on where it happens in the tusk. So the earliest part of the tusk is at the tip, and as they get older and older and older, you get farther up towards the pulp cavity, or where the tusk fits into the skull. This tusk actually goes into the skull quite a bit, so it would go all the way back somewhere around here. So you have a lot more material inside of the skull than what you see exposed. And because of all of this, tusks are really amazing sources of data. So even if you just have the tusk and not any other part of the mastodon, or of many proboscideans, in fact, you can find out all this kind of information, like what is its genus, how old is it, in terms of when did it live, 11,000 years ago, 12, 13,000 years ago. You can tell if it's male or female. You can tell its diet, how old it was when it died, how old it was when it was mature, maybe even the season that it was born, and sometimes the season of death and the cause of death. And again, this is based all on just the tusk. So where did mastodons live? Well, we're specifically talking about North American mastodons today. So North American mastodons lived as far north as Alaska, as far south as Mexico City, and on each coast and pretty much everywhere in between. They lived at the end of the last ice age, or during the last ice age, in the epoch called the Pleistocene. So this is where we have our mastodons, and once again, just to kind of hammer home the point that mastodons are absolutely not dinosaurs. Dinosaurs lived in the in the Mesozoic era, between 66 and somewhere around 230 something million years ago. So they are far displaced from dinosaurs and are much different from them. You can see each one of these orange dots represents a location where a mastodon was found, and there are some clusters of them. There's this big cluster here that's in Michigan. We've got a bunch in Florida, and then of course we have a bunch on the West Coast in California. So mastodons are extinct. That's one of the saddest parts about them. But one of the big questions about mastodons are why they went extinct. So some of the classic hypotheses about mastodon extinction are the same hypotheses for the extinction of all the megamammals at the end of the Pleistocene, or at the end of the last ice age. And these have to do with climate change and overhunting by humans. So these two factors probably contributed to the extinction of mastodons in some way or the other. But because mastodons lived at such different locations and were in different environments across North America, each of their populations experienced different types of pressures, different types of benefits, and therefore there might be some locations where different factors were more responsible for the extinction locally. So if we look at different causes for different regions, we might look in the Great Lakes region and see that there's a lot of evidence for overhunting by humans, a lot of evidence for climate change, in which it got very cold very quickly. That might have affected the South a little bit more. But then we have other possible hypotheses like habitat loss up in the north, no more forests, no more mastodons. We've got an unstable ecosystem also in the Great Lakes region, where there might not have been enough predators to keep the prey in check. So there might not have been enough predators to keep the mastodons in check, which means that resources might have been limited, and that would leave the populations vulnerable for extinction. And then we get out west, we have some other herbivores out here that might have been better adapted for their circumstances, and so perhaps bison, for example, outcompeted mastodons. So these are some of the big questions that we're looking at in mastodon paleobiology. So now that we've got some background information in there, we can start on our two mastodons again, but actually not quite, because I wanted to take a moment to talk to you a little bit about how I became a paleontologist. There are many different ways to become a paleontologist, and there are many different jobs that paleontologists can do. So this is the route that I took. So we're going to start all the way back in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I grew up. This is a diorama in the Milwaukee Public Museum. Very clearly shows our T-Rex eating a Triceratops. And this was my favorite exhibit at the museum. I thought it was so cool and so scary. And I would just spend a really long time, probably right at this railing here, just looking at this diorama and trying to figure out what else I could see in this image. So we've got these little dinosaurs here. There are footprints of T-Rex. There are little footprints all over the place. What kind of trees are there? What other kind of plants are there? What's the climate like? All of these questions just occurred to me as I sat and I stared at this for, it feels like hours and hours. My actual first job in paleontology was at the Milwaukee Public Museum as an intern, and at that point I worked on invertebrate fossils, so the animals without a backbone. Trilobites, like the state fossil of Wisconsin, Calamini, is an example of some of the animals that I worked with there. After interning at the Milwaukee Public Museum, I went to school at Purdue University in Indiana to pursue a graduate degree in geology. And I got that and went on to Michigan State University. So that brings us to some mastodons, but this time we want to look at 211 mastodons. So when I went to grad school at Michigan State, I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do. I liked Ice Age mammals. I liked dinosaurs. I liked other mammals too. But the professor that I was working with there worked on Cretaceous fish, and I thought, well, that'd be kind of cool. Maybe I'll work on Cretaceous fish. So once I got there, I met a retired professor there, Dr. Al Holman. And Dr. Holman was actually a specialist on reptiles, but he also had a passion for vertebrates of Michigan. So one of the things that he worked on was documenting the different mastodons in Michigan, and he advised a master's thesis student on a project where she was basically assessing all of the mastodon and mammoth sites throughout the state. So at that time of the publication of her thesis, there were 211 mastodons in Michigan. And when I saw this, something just kind of clicked with me, and I thought, I really, really want to know what happens or what had happened underneath the very place that I am living. So a mastodon or herds of mastodons crossed exactly where I was standing. What were those like? So basically that started my love affair with mastodons. After I got my master's degree in geological sciences from Michigan State, took a few years off. I worked as a microscopist, identifying asbestos in an industrial lab. And then I left that pretty soon and worked for Children's Museum as a museum educator. And then finally the mastodons called me back. And so that's when I went to the University of Michigan, and I pursued my PhD with the Museum of Paleontology. And at this point, we are down to 13 mastodons. So my dissertation research centered around 13 tusks. These are some of them. You can see that these tusks are relatively slender, but still fairly long, and so that's a characteristic of female mastodons. At the time, mastodons that occurred in, or multiple mastodons that occurred at one site was a relatively rare thing in the fossil record, and especially all females. It seemed like male mastodons showed up in the fossil record a lot more than females. So I was very excited to study these particular tusks, and to determine how they accumulated in this particular bog, essentially. And what I learned is that they were probably not members of the same family group as we see in modern elephants, but that there is a possibility. The only hypothesis that I couldn't rule out was that they were actually deposited there by humans who were trying to preserve some of the meat of the mastodons throughout the winter in case their hunting was bad. So that's basically the gist of my story of 13 mastodons at the University of Michigan. I got my PhD and was very lucky to move to Georgia Southern University, where I got my current, where my current position is. So I've been here since 2010, August of 2010. And here's a little glimpse into our Hall of Natural History there. So coming from mastodons, moving south, I've now got a bunch of new types of fossils here, primarily sharks. Shark teeth are our state fossil. And things like mosasaurs, so some swimming reptiles. So these are the sorts of things that I have in my collection now. But I also have a good proportion of extinct whales. This is Georgicetus, the whale of Georgia from about 41 million years ago. And fortunately, mastodons. So I'm now in a different region than I was when I was at Michigan and when I was at Michigan State, and I basically was very familiar with mastodons of the Great Lakes region. So I was really excited to move into a different region and see, what are southern mastodons like? Well, the first thing that I came across here was that there's this hypothesis called the thermal enclave hypothesis. And all of these highlighted states here are part of this alleged thermal enclave, which goes from this 35-degree north parallel to the Gulf of Mexico and from the Appalachian Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean here. So within this area, it was expected to be a bit warmer than in other areas of North America. And here you can see plotted on this map, all of these little dots, these little brown dots, these are all mastodon fossil locations. So you can see that there are a ton in Florida, but not quite so many in Georgia and further north. These squares, these show places where evidence of fossil pollen was analyzed. And the fossil pollen is what tells us that it was probably warmer there. There's a mixture of both cool and warm climate plants, as well as plants that would have been in wetland environments. But one thing that really stuck out to us was this here. This is something that's called Tillandsia, or informally Spanish moss. And so if you've ever been to the South, you know that Spanish moss is all over the place on the trees, but that Spanish moss requires a relatively warm environment. I think it's at least 50 degrees in most circumstances. So when we think of the Ice Age, we usually think of really, really cold, but it's possible that the mastodons that were living in this region actually had a little bit of a warm, slightly warmer advantage compared to their contemporaries in other parts of North America. So then that led me to question, is there a characteristic southeastern mastodon? So there's this biological rule, which basically is an observation that body size usually increases as temperature drops. So you would have bigger animals in colder areas. This tends not to work with elephants, so it probably didn't work with mastodons either. And when I started to research it, basically I was led to this paper by a scientist named Loomis that characterized some mastodons from South Carolina as having an unusually heavy build and a tendency of southern mastodons. And if we look at some mastodons from the literature, we can interpret a height at their shoulder, which is about 9 feet or taller. So this is a pretty large mastodon. So I wondered, is this really characteristic of mastodons everywhere? Or is this just a real unique pocket or unique population within the Southeast? Now that takes us to our two mastodons. So we're going to start out with Chaz. So Chaz Mastodon, I gave him his nickname because he is the North Charleston Mastodon. So he's from North Charleston, South Carolina. Chaz was discovered back in 2012 when they were working on a residential development. So he was found in an overbank deposit, basically when they were digging up the ground to build housing. Like I showed you in that map, there aren't that many mastodons north of Florida, at least not that many mastodon localities north of Florida where there's a good proportion of the skeleton left. In Georgia, for example, we can find lots of pieces, like we might find fragments of teeth or fragments of ribs or things like that in dredge piles, but not real good full skeletons unless we're lucky. So this was actually only the 5th reported mastodon of South Carolina at the time that it was found. And we don't have an exact age for it, but we have a range somewhere between about 20,000 and 11,700 years ago. So these are just a couple of the remains of Chaz that were found. This is the tip of a tusk. We've got a molar here, a big tooth, and we've got parts of its backbone. But they also found things like the femur, the jaw, nearly complete foot bones, and other tusk portions. So the first thing I want to talk about that we learned about Chaz was how old he was. So mastodons have 6 different sets of teeth that run through each quadrant of their life, or quadrant of their mouth throughout their life. So when we look at the tooth, we can characterize what it looks like, its physical characteristics, its morphology, and we can figure out if it's tooth 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, essentially. And that, compared to the same state of tooth eruption in elephants, can give us an idea of how old the mastodon is. So in this case, Chaz has the last tooth in his mouth. He has a crypt in front of the tooth where molar number 5 would have been, and it's got some wear on the front, but not a lot of wear on the back. So given this, we would give Chaz an age of 37 to 41 African elephant equivalent years, or AEY, which is another way of saying Law's age 22, which is the name of the person who developed this system for aging elephants based on tooth eruption and wear. So given that, we're looking at Chaz at about 40 years old. And if we want to think about a lifespan for a mastodon, perhaps 50 or 60 would be a good assessment of a regular lifespan for a mastodon. All right, how about what species is Chaz? So we have mastodons all across the continent, and very, very recently, a new species of mastodon was named, and of course that was based on specimens at the Western Science Center. Well, Chaz here is not one of those mastodons. Chaz is an American mastodon, or Mammut americanum, and basically this characteristic tooth shape is broad and squarish, which is different from Western teeth, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So I keep calling Chaz male, so I'm kind of giving it away, is he male or female, but I want to show you how we figure this out. This is Chaz's femur, or upper leg bone, and if you measure the width at the greatest point, well actually it was down here, the width at the greatest point of the femur versus the total length of the femur, you can get a separation between females and males. So these circles here are, the red ones are female mastodons from the Great Lakes region. The blue are male mastodons of the Great Lake region, and the star is Chaz. So what you can see is that Chaz is more similar to the males than to the females, but that it is quite large, quite a bit larger than some of those males. So that's a pretty good bit of evidence to show that Chaz is a male. Now we can also look at mastodon tusk circumference. So I showed you the tip of the mastodon tusk, but we can also look at the base of the tusk. Now tusks basically get thicker as they move away from the tip towards their pulp cavities. So because we had the base of the tusk, but not the whole tusk, I can still get an assessment of what its widest girth was. And so if we look at where Chaz falls out, there he is, along the same male mastodons that he was in the other diagram, far larger than the female mastodons. And again, these are all of Great Lakes region. But what we do see is among individuals of his same age, his tusk circumference is actually kind of slender, and I found that to be really surprising because usually big mastodons have the biggest tusks, or at least that's what I thought. So if we look at Chaz, we can wonder, is Chaz our characteristic southern mastodon? And so this is my hypothesis for what a southern mastodon is. They're tall, they have relatively average to small girths, and they have broad, squarish molars. Chaz himself was an adult male, and that would make him the biggest of the population in that males are larger than females. So big, tall mastodons, relatively slender tusks. And this was something that I found really surprising because I was used to big mastodons having big tusks. So that takes us to the West Coast. So is there, in fact, a characteristic California mastodon? Well, the literature says that they're pretty small. And here you can see I've done a scale of mastodons. This is our East Coast mastodon, so basically that approximately 9 feet at the shoulder mastodon, and our West Coast mastodon, which looks substantially smaller. And according to some sources, somewhere between 5 and 7.9 feet at the shoulder. So that's a lot smaller than a lot smaller than the West, a lot smaller than the East, and a lot smaller than the Great Lakes region in the Midwest. So let's look at some more of these Western mastodons. The La Brea tar pits is probably the most famous source of Western mastodons. And in fact, that's where the measurements that interpret mastodons as small came from. The Western Science Center, though, has mastodons from Diamond Valley Lake, this man-made reservoir that was dug up starting in 1995. So all of the mastodons were found, or many of the mastodons at the Western Science Center were found at this man-made lake. So this is a lot newer than the La Brea tar pits in terms of timing of discovery. People have been excavating in the tar pits since the 1900s. So we've got a relatively new assemblage of mastodons, and until Dr. Dooley came to the Western Science Center, I don't think anyone really looked at them in too much detail. So let's start with Max here. So here's Max on the bottom right as he is at the Western Science Center. Max, in fact, appears to be quite large. So here's Max compared to your average Eastern mastodon. Based on the distal width of the femur, so basically the width of the leg bone, we can see that Max is much bigger than Great Lakes region mastodons, males, and of course females as well. And he's even taller than Chaz based on this interpretation. So Max has been interpreted as being greater than 9.8 feet, so almost 10 feet at the shoulder, which is a lot bigger than Western mastodons were expected to be. Max, I guess conveniently, is about the same age as Chaz based on tooth eruption and wear. So they are really good mastodons to compare to one another since they're the same sex and they're the same age. They are, though, different species. Here we can see the contrast between molars of Max and Chaz. Chaz was Mammut americanum, and Max is Mammut pacificus, which has these long, slender molars. Now, one thing that Max has that Chaz doesn't is a complete tusk. And this is really exciting because have I talked about how tusks grow. So if you have a whole tusk, you basically have the whole record of the mastodon's life, except for some of the material that was worn off due to wear, because mastodons will use their tusks to scrape away snow to get to food below, to fight with one another, to scratch off bark, and a variety of other things. But in general, we can look at the changes in life from early in life to the end of life, and this can be reflected in its maximum tusk circumference, or its changes in tusk circumference through life. So on the x-axis here, we basically start from the tip, and you measure circumference at about every 10 centimeters, and you get this tusk curve. And so it shows how there's an increase in tusk circumference until you hit a point where it's essentially flattened out and then tends to decrease at the end of life. So because of this, we can associate tusk circumference with age. So in an effort to try to balance out what I knew about mastodons based on the Great Lakes region versus what I'm seeing in the East Coast and the West Coast, and of course specifically here to the West Coast, I wanted to compare their ages with their tusk sizes. And this is a little bit of a messy graph here, but basically what it shows is we've got these boxes in blue, and these blue boxes indicate the maximum tusk circumference of our Great Lakes region mastodons versus the number of layers in the tusk. And for some of them, we also have an African elephant equivalent age, which is going to be, again, based on the molar position and wear. So if we look at our mastodons from the Great Lakes region, we have some teenagers all the way up to about 38-year-olds at the most. Now, if we look at the black triangles here, these are Max and his friends at Diamond Valley Lake. And so I used this line of regression from tusk age versus based on annual increments or annual layers versus tusk circumference to predict what their tusk age would be based on that tusk circumference. And if you look at this, you can see that some of our Western Science Center mastodons, we've got like a 28-year-old here, and then all the way up to one that is somewhere between 51 and 59 years old. And this is affectionately called the old man. And if we zoom in here, you can see that these teeth, this is the last tooth that's in wear in this mastodon, and that tooth is really highly worn. So this is one of our oldest individuals there. Now, what you might be seeing already is that it's weird because at 51 to 59 African elephant years, it's got a lot smaller circumference than a 34 to 38-year-old Great Lakes region mastodon. So it looks like, in general, tusk circumferences for mastodons out west are relatively small for the size of these individuals. So just like Chaz, we have relatively slender tusks when I would expect there to be really big tusks with really big mastodons. Oh, and I forgot I have Chaz jump in right there. Chaz fits very, very neatly right next to Max. Okay, so again, unlike Chaz, Max has a full tusk, so we can look at tusk length. Presumably, in general, the longer tusks belong to older mastodons with some differences at the end of life due to wear, but we can look at that very generally. So we see the length of the tusk on the x-axis here, and then the maximum tusk circumference on the y-axis here. And we can see, again, compared to Great Lakes region mastodons, Max looks a lot more like mastodons in their early 20s than in their late 30s. So again, Max's tusk length appears to be smaller than expected as well. So not only is it skinnier, but it appears to be shorter, but it doesn't have a whole ton of wear at the tip. We have some tusks that have their tusks, or some mastodons where the tusks are broken off or really blunted at the end, and that's not something that we see with Max. So if we can summarize Max, we've got an adult male, a Pacific mastodon. His molars are very narrow. He seems to be very tall, but his tusk, again, does not scale with its body size, and that his tusk appears to be fairly short and fairly slender, as expected for a mastodon of his size. So is this, in fact, typical for a California mastodon? Take one step back here because I started out Max's tale by telling you that Western mastodons are small. Max is most certainly not small. In fact, he is about 1.25 times taller than the average La Brea mastodon. And when I looked at this difference in height, it occurred to me that the difference between male and female mastodons in the Great Lakes region is approximately 1.25, with males taller than the females. So one thing that I'm very interested in exploring is, are the La Brea mastodons that gave the West Coast mastodons that small reputation, are they in fact females, and are in fact mastodons like Max more typical of Western mastodons? In general, I think West Coasters are big. Again, I need more data to test this hypothesis. So let's summarize then. We've got our southeastern coast and our west coast mastodons. So west coast, pretty tall. Southeast coast, pretty tall. West coast, tusks of average girth. Southeast coast, tusks of average girth. Length we can't assess for Chaz because we don't have a full tusk, but we can see that the mastodons in the west coast have relatively short tusks, at least for Max. Max has narrow molars and Chaz has broad molars. And so my big conclusion from this data is that big body size doesn't equate to big tusks in either region, though it does appear to equate to that in the Midwest and Great Lakes region. So why are these populations different? Well, first we do know that they are members of different species. Same genus, both mammut, different species. Mammut pacificus in the west, Mammut americanum in the east, and through much of the Great Lakes region. So the short answer to why our North American populations are different excuse me, is because they're members of different species. But what are these characteristics adapted for? And that's kind of a we don't know. So if we get to the end of our tale of two mastodons, it doesn't really have an end. We can look at differences between these two individuals as being related to different habitats, different behaviors, slight differences in diet, slight differences in climate. We've got mastodons in the west in intermontane forests, and in the southeast, they're more in a kind of a prairie, forested woodland type of environment. So there are a number of different regions that, a number of different reasons that could result in mastodons with distinct physical characteristics in each region, and that is something that I and many other people who are interested in American mastodons are going to continue to explore. So the tale of two mastodons never really ends. So with that, I want to thank the following people, especially the Alf Museum and Western Center, for inviting me to do this talk, which again, tons of fun. The artists that made the mastodons that I showed you today, Brian Eng and Lara Tchaikovsky-Streliski, everybody at the Western Science Center who helped me to gather all this data and really did a lot of work with me to get this data. Some people at Georgia Southern who helped work on these projects, and the College of Charleston Natural History Museum, who allowed me to meet and fall in love with Chaz. So with that, I'll end my talk, and I will be happy to entertain any questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Katy.
You're welcome.
I can just imagine Max tweeting now.
He was probably live tweeting the whole thing. My tusks are not small.
That's a really interesting thing to see, like how different that those two species were across just different regions of the U.S. Like in today's world, do you kind of see that differences in elephant populations? Is it that obvious?
Well, if we look at, say, forest versus savanna elephants, we can see some pretty big differences in their morphologies and their characteristics. The forest elephants tend to be smaller and have straighter tusks. And then the savanna elephants, of course, both of these are in Africa, and the savanna elephants tend to be bigger with more robust tusks. So just even kind of a casual look at some of these, in this case, well, those would be different species according to most people now. You can see some differences. And those two individuals, the savanna and the forest elephants, their ranges butt right up against each other, and sometimes they still mix reproductively.
That is so cool. Evolution, you know? Oh,
right?
It's Darwin Day, right?
It is.
Yes.
Perfect timing.
Yes. Yesterday was also the International Day for Women and Girls in Science. So this is a 1-2 punch of a day. Awesome. Alrighty. Well, we have some great questions, which I appreciate because it just means people are recognizing how cool mastodons are and that they should want to know everything about them.
Do you want me to, should I leave?
Not biased.
I can leave. It's okay.
I am not biased at all. All right. This is from frequent viewer Mermaid Labs. Approximately how many of those big teeth did a mastodon typically have?
Oh, yes. Okay. So within the jaw at any given time, they usually had about 2 on the bottom jaw and 2 on the top. And then throughout their life, these teeth moved like a conveyor belt towards the front of the jaw. So at the end of their life, they would have amassed 6 teeth, but at any given time, they only had, let's say, 2, 4, 6, 8 in their jaw at the same time. But as these teeth are worn, they're pushed forward, and once they get pushed out of the mouth entirely, they either get spit out or swallowed. So this very different way of tooth replacement, called horizontal tooth replacement, is really handy for aging those mastodons, as opposed to us when we have a tooth that falls out, a new one comes in underneath it, so we have vertical tooth replacement.
Just want to shout out that desmostilians have that type of tooth replacement too. So
nice.
We like marine mammals here.
They're good.
Alrighty. This is another question. Do you think there might be fewer southwest mastodons found in Georgia and the Carolinas because of the depositional environment?
That is a really great question. And in fact, that is exactly what I think. Florida has an environment that is full of karst topography, it's full of cave, limestone, and they certainly have an environment that is more amenable or a little bit better for preservation. So when we get to the mastodons in Georgia, the ones that have been found, well, like many mastodons, they've been found during construction, and we don't have the exact type of depositional environment that would make them easy to find. So I think that's absolutely right. I spent a little bit of time when I first moved down to Georgia on some of our barrier islands, because the barrier islands are where our Pleistocene sediment is, and that's where some of these mastodons were found. And I did some surveying, and I thought, surely I'll be able to find a good area to find mastodons. And eventually I had to kind of give up, even though I haven't really given up, because I know they're there somewhere. But yeah, there simply isn't the type of depositional environment that we would want our mastodons to be in. So you are right on the mark there.
Darn.
In terms of preservation, is it more likely for larger animals to get preserved in the fossil record, or does that not really matter?
See, now that's always a good question to me, because I think it kind of depends, right? If we're talking about vertebrate animals, I think that the bigger ones are going to be easier to spot, but their populations tend to be smaller. So something like rodents, there's going to be a ton of rodents, but their bones might be a little bit harder to come by. So when it comes to mastodons, it's more likely to find, say, one random fragment of a mastodon than it would be maybe one fragment of a tiny animal. So in that way, we might have more of them represented in our collections, but that doesn't mean that there are more of them out there. It's just that they're so big, sometimes they can be a little bit easier to find.
Cool.
This question is from Emil. What's going on with that really huge length-width ratio animal from Kentucky?
Oh, is that the tooth? I think
so.
So that's Dr. Dooley's stuff. So I used it for comparison. So he would know a little bit better about that one. But there is some variation across both species in terms of their tooth size and their tooth shape. So I don't know exactly about that one, but I know that there were a few outliers that are always a little puzzling, and we always see some sort of variation in our populations. One beautiful thing about mastodons, just one I'll mention, is that there are so many of them that we can actually see this variation. So no species is going to be uniform across the board in any characteristic, but sometimes we have these outliers that just have some funky measurement or some funky kind of feature, and I'm guessing that's what that Kentucky mastodon was.
All right. Oh, this is a good question from Lucas. He says, I've read some papers on AEY, but would we expect a mastodon to reach roughly the same 65 plus year lifespan that modern elephants do?
Ooh.
Well, that is an excellent question. And with the the AEY, the African equivalent years, that's why we want to make sure that we are calling them African equivalent years, because we need just some sort of reference for them. Mastodons, if we don't know how many layers are in their tusks, which is still a minimum, they might have different eruption and wear stages, at least a little bit different. So we don't want to use like a 1-to-1 ratio to say that Max was absolutely 40 years old, but he was, if we equate him to an African elephant, that's about how old he would be. In terms of lifespan, we do kind of, at least I do, kind of tend to equate mastodon lifespan to elephant lifespan. But as I've looked at a number of different mastodons, I think the oldest that I've seen is actually the old man, who's about 59 years old. So I think that, at least based on my observations and what I've seen in papers, that it's not a bad idea to think 60, 65 is a good lifespan for mastodons.
So Max didn't do too badly in terms of when he died.
He worked hard.
Yeah, and got hit in the face a lot.
Right.
He lived a full life.
He most certainly lived a full life, yes.
Wait, what do you mean he fought a lot?
Well, Max has some injuries on his jaw. So Brian Eng has depicted that in the mural that he did for our mastodon, which you can see at our museum.
Where did I put that?
There it is. Yeah.
That's Max fighting dirty, right? Pulling hair.
He's pulling hair.
Mm-hmm.
What a jerk.
And there's that tusk that's gonna get right into his skull.
Yeah, so if anybody visits the Western Science Center when we are open to the public again, if you look closely at Max's jaw, you will be able to see some injuries from a fight. Probably that happened a lot like that one. Yeah, Max got in some scrapes.
Is there any evidence of the East Coast mastodons? getting close or in like or overlapping in ranges with the West Coast ones, or is there a different species in between?
Well, they're in between. There's still a Mammut americanum. So based on Dr. Dooley's study, they're basically through much of the U.S. they're American mastodons, and then it's not until we get very close to the West Coast that they're Pacific. So American mastodons, at least as we call them now, have a pretty big range compared to the Pacific. So based on their teeth and other characteristics used to distinguish Pacific and American mastodons, like number of vertebrae in the sacral region and robustness of femur. Based on those characteristics, pretty much everybody else but the West Coasters are American mastodons.
Cool. So the West Coast mastodon's like, we're comfy here. We're
Yeah,
just gonna chill.
exactly.
We're good. We're good.
We're
Typical
doing our
West
thing.
Coasters.
Yeah, the West Coast personality was already there. All right, I think this is going to be our last question. So we had a lot of good questions that we're not going to be able to get to today. So thank you everybody for your questions. But I think we're going to end on this one, and I think this will be fun. It's Max, the cutest mastodon to have ever lived. I mean,
Wow. I mean,
look at
him.
Look at him.
I have a hard time with this.
Thank you for this question, Bailey.
I mean, you want me to work this out emotionally? I think that Max is very, very cute. And I hesitate to say he's the cutest ever because I spent a lot of time working with some other mastodons during my dissertation and during my master's thesis that I got really attached to. And so I know Max doesn't like to hear this, but I know that I have a mastodon named Fred that I'm a real big fan of. There's one who I call Valentine, that she's pretty adorable. So it's very hard to pick. It really is. But Max is very cute.
The viewers can't hear it now, but there's a Twitter screen going on just now from Max's account. I swear it's happening.
I believe it.
Yeah, Max is probably my favorite, but we've been hanging out for a while, so everybody can pick a favorite mastodon.
Well, I mean, how many mastodons have an official plushie of them?
That's very true.
That's true.
By the way, that's a good point. Finally, the Western Science Center has been able to get those Max Mastodon plushies up on our website. So if you are interested in purchasing one, you can finally do that now and support our museum while we're closed. So if you want to go ahead to westernsciencecenter.org and buy a Max Mastodon plushie, those are available now.
I ordered
Hashtag
two.
Not an ad.
Not sponsored.
I have my Max plushie like sitting up on my shelf over there.
Yeah, mine is somewhere in here. And
All right. Well, I think that does it for us today. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Dr. Smith. We really, really enjoyed that story, and obviously there is still more to debate on who is cuter, Chaz or Max, but that's for another episode. If the viewers at home want to learn more about your research or learn more about your museum, where can they go to find out about that?
Well, I have a Twitter account. Personal Twitter account is at Dr_Mastodona. And our museum Twitter account is at Georgicetus. So Georgicetus will definitely give you more of the scientific view, and my personal account will give you the scientific view plus more of the who's cuter kind of questions too.
I feel like this debate's going to go onto Twitter later, and I'm just going to get a bunch of notifications about mastodons today.
I'm sensing my phone blowing up right now. And it's all Max.
Well, again, thank you so much, and thank you so much to all the viewers at home. If you like this show and want to support programs like it at the Western Center and the Alf Museum, you can find links on how to do that below. And as always, please continue to like and subscribe for more stories from the world of paleontology, and we'll see you all next Friday. Bye.
Thank you.